Welcome to the opening of Waiting for Mother Russia in 2 acts, photography by Will Sands, on my right. We are honored to have him here, and we'll have the work up along with digital images from his Maidan Unfinished exhibition for the next several months. Will Sands is going to open with a little bit of a tour of a few of his images and talk to us about the photography he's been doing in Ukraine for the last several years. And then we'll be joined, and I don't have my program here, but by Lev and Tatiana, who are pointing to the right, in the right direction, who are over here. Lev will be giving us a kind of a financial business perspective on some of the issues and motivations beyond, or in front of Maidan, what pushed that, where we are now with finances, corruption, the economy, how those things have played into it. And Tatiana, who is a graduate student here and scholar from Ukraine at the University of Illinois in Chicago, is going to be talking to us a little bit about who lives in Ukraine and who are the participants in peace building in the conflict as it's happened, and how did we get to where we are, and then maybe hopefully where we can go forward. So we're going to start now, and I'm going to give this over to Will.
Okay, first of all, thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. I'm going to show just quickly 2 images, because I think they're pretty indicative of the conflict and the complexities of the conflict, especially speaking to national identities within Ukraine. So the first picture is of Natasha. Natasha was a 26-year-old originally from Donetsk. This picture was shot in an apartment in Kiev during the Maidan uprising. So she explained to me as a young Ukrainian, Maidan really appealed to her. After weeks of watching the protests on TV from Donetsk, she felt like she had to come to Kiev and participate. For her, in her words, this was a revolution. So revolution or not, what was going on in Maidan was obviously historical. And young Ukrainians from across the country were enamored with Maidan's energy and the hope of a different and a different future the uprising gave them. Natasha was not an exception. So there were lots of people from eastern Ukraine that were in Maidan, participated in Maidan. Admittedly, she worried about what was going to happen to her when she decided to go back to Donetsk as the conflict was developing. So this is the second image I'm going to show you, and the last one. So this is Sergei. He's a 24-year-old from Donetsk as well. He traveled to Maidan in the fall of 2013 to support the uprising. He had heard that there were people that were paying for participation. So his decision was not wholly political. There was an economic aspect to it. Once he got to Maidan, he then became active in the Ukrainian nationalist movement, joined one of the nationalist brigades, and after Yanukovych was overthrown and the beginning of hostilities broke out in eastern Ukraine, he was deployed. Once he got to Dnipropetrovsk, he realized that he might have made a mistake. So after his paychecks were delayed and he'd suffered one too many hazing activities, he decided that he was going to leave, go AWOL. But this was obviously not a simple decision, given that he was from Donetsk and he had to go back to Donetsk. So he got a friend to come and pick him up and drive him back into the Donetsk region. Now that Sergei is in Donetsk, he's basically holed up in his apartment. And he's worried what will happen to him if people find out that he was a participant in Ukrainian nationalist politics. And obviously worried that there will be some revenge taken. So yeah, I mean, I think that his his identity and the complexity of it is indicative of the experience for many people. That it is not a simple conflict by any stretch of the imagination. So that's likely that's all.
Thank you very much. And those two images are obviously samples from two sections of the work, from the Maidan work that you see up front in the monitor and from images on the wall. And I think it's interesting that they both reflect young people in a growing population who've kind of come through different journeys to where they are now. Tetiana Dedejevich, who is a doctoral candidate, as I mentioned, at the University of Chicago, University of Illinois at Chicago in Slavic and Baltic languages, is here on his right, and Lev Holubek, who is a Chicago-based partner in PwC's advisory M&A practice, but more to the point, has worked in Kiev and brings to us some international experience on this. We're going to join the conversation now. And Tetiana, what I was hoping you could do is maybe just take us a little bit, both from your professional and academic experience, and as a Ukrainian, to explain who we just saw, who is involved right now. And we've talked in these conversations leading up to today about how you see national participants and how that might be defined by those people who are involved in the conflict.
Thank you to all of you for coming here. And if we are talking about people from Donetsk, maybe I will start from a brief letter I received yesterday from the woman I have met her the last summer in the Oral History Project, and she is from Donetsk. She is in her early 50s, so she is not the representative of the young generation, and she moved to Kiev. And when I was preparing for this event, I wrote a letter to her with questions, and I asked her what is going on in the East, who is fighting whom, why did you move to Kiev, why did not you move to Russia or stay at home, don't you regret that you moved to Kiev, do you keep in touch with people in Donetsk, and what do they think about their situation? Does Donetsk People's Republic stand a chance of becoming an independent state and in its own right? Here is her answer, and this is translation from Ukrainian to English. This is an important moment because the last summer she did not speak Ukrainian. She was Russian speaker, but she moved to Kiev. She started to do embroidery and learn Ukrainian vyshyvanka. So she started to make money from craft, and she answered. Let me point out from the start that these questions are so important and crucial. Those who call this conflict a civil war come from a purely Russian position, or to be exact, from the position of Russian propaganda. I am deeply convinced that this is a war Russia is waging against Ukraine. A war fought insidiously by dumping locals into it with bribes, deceptions, pseudo-patriotic rhetoric, and other strictly propagandistic methods. We moved mostly at my mother's request. She lives in a small town of Zvenyhorodka in Cherkasy region, and she was worried sick about us. Moving to Russia was not even an option. I have been to Russia a lot of times. I have a lot of friends there, but I believe it's much harder to get back on your feet in that country. And the prospects it offers are not alluring, especially now that Western sanctions have enacted. The question of whether or not we regret this decision is hard to answer, because we left behind a lot of friends, colleagues, our houses, and all our belongings accumulated over the years. But we do realize that life during wartime is impossible. Most of the people I know cannot move away at all. Either they have nowhere to go, or they are tied down by their elderly parents. Some don't want to abandon their houses and offices to be most likely pillaged by looters. I don't know anyone who believes in all those pretty fairy tales about our young republic. Even the retirees most susceptible to propaganda are already disillusioned because that very same propaganda originally promised them two pensions, one from Ukraine and another from Russia. The prices have skyrocketed, so they cannot even buy the basics like food and medication. While the old folks struggle to make ends meet, TV is promising them once again happiness and prosperity just around the corner. Most of them realize they simply won't make it until that corner is turned. As for the future, it's a tough question. There are a lot of factors to consider. I wish things were as they used to be when life was peaceful. So this is another voice from Donetsk, and this is a representative of the woman who lived half of her life, and it was not easy to move to Kyiv, but she made this decision. She and her husband changed their profession. Their son volunteered to the front from the Ukrainian side. And when we are talking about who are Ukrainians, they are citizens of Ukraine. And they came up from different corners, different identities. Ukraine has more than 1,000 years of history, and this history was not so plenty, and different events were happening there. And a very long period of time, identity in Ukraine, when we are talking about Ukrainians, was built up on the ethnic component as over Europe. But the last decades, people started to realize that their identity is not their ethnic background. Even more, their identity even is not their language. Their identity is what they want to live in, how they want to build up their life. And I also met a wonderful woman in her 60s, Nadezhda Komarova. Originally she was from Russia, even more. She was the leader of Komsomol organization in Dnipropetrovsk in the Soviet period of times. In the Soviet period of time, and she moved to Kyiv and was the leader of Komsomol organization in the late Soviets. And then the Soviet Union collapsed. She did the second degree in sociology, and her son participated in Orange Revolution. Her son participated in Revolution of Dignity, and her son was one of the first people who volunteered to the army. And she doesn't speak Ukrainian, but she received Ukrainian citizenship, and she considered herself as Ukrainian. So the question, who are Ukrainians? Those who want to be Ukrainians. Those who share the idea that Ukraine can be, and that Ukraine can exist and can be realized as a country. It's not those who are looking to the past, but those who are looking to the future. And the story is very complex, and there are many voices in this story.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I was struck in researching for this evening and in talking with Will is the question Jerome McDonald sort of asked the two of us yesterday before we went on air, is this the Cold War? Is this X versus Y, them versus us from either side? And Will seems to have found in his photos ways to tell a more nuanced story, and seems to resist that idea that it's this narrative or that, or what you speak or what you don't speak defines who you are. And you talk about a very inclusive, in the way that you talk about this, inclusive Ukraine. You touched on the economics of this and the economic push factors, for example, for this woman. And Lev, I wondered if you could jump in here a little bit, and for those who haven't followed this kind of from Maidan forward, maybe take us from an economic point of view a little bit from why I would have gone to protest in Maidan, perhaps on the surface about whether the president was going to sign a deal for a bailout from the European Union or from Russia, from the Federation. But was that because there has been long corruption from the oligarchical society, and how that impacts sort of day to day? What does that do to people to live in this kind of society, and what does it look like?
Thank you, and if you don't mind, I'm going to stand up. These chairs are hard to sit on and speak, especially when there's a lot of kind of many thoughts and emotions running through the mind at the same time. So, but I also apologize for the tie. I think I'm one of two people in the room. I actually dressed up. I dressed up for today. But first of all, thank you for the opportunity to address what seems like a very interesting audience, and thanks for the audience for taking the time to come and to listen and to interact and speak and take a look at the images. I think the images speak volumes when you have a chance to really take a look. The economic factors and the economic history should not be taken into any small period of time. I think what we need to do is look back and see how the culture has evolved, the economic culture of Ukraine has evolved over time. And let's not mistake the fact that Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Empire. It was a very large part. It was the second largest socialist republic within the Soviet Empire. It lived and died by its rules and its economic strategy and economic philosophies. And those economic philosophies really, if you really want to cut it down, led to, the state has everything and the person has nothing. The person owes everything to the state. That led to a lot of different behaviors, which were really behaviors of self-sufficiency. So if you found yourself on a farm, and the motivation for the farm was actually that you have to provide all of your goods, all of your harvest to the state, of course you learn to hold some back for yourself somehow, because that's the way you lived. That's the only way you lived. And you found a way to barter with whatever you had, because that's the way you lived. And if you wanted to actually have a little bit of something extra, that was the only way you could do it. So I'm simplifying it to a certain degree, but I don't think too much. And that philosophy then permeated, and that was, from Stalin's collectivization all the way through 1991, and through Gorbachev's glasnost policy and perestroika. And then in 1991, Ukraine finally finds itself a independent state. And the question is, what does independent mean? Independent of whom? Politically independent, but economically, nobody had an idea of what to do or how to proceed. That led to new governments, and I have friends who tell me that they were advisors to the president at that time, and the president saw the red phone and didn't know the red phone was ringing and he wasn't answering anymore, and then the red phone stopped ringing. What was the red phone? The red phone was the phone that was telling him how to run the country. It wasn't happening anymore. So now a suddenly free or independent country of 45 million people has to fend for itself one way or another. And then went a period of privatization. In that period of privatization, those who were in high places, again, no different, don't kid yourself, in the days of the Soviet Union, those in high places lived pretty darn well. They might not have been billionaires, but they were certainly a class above all of the citizens that had to provide for them. And that philosophy continued during the privatization period, and people abused the system and really found ways to be part of privatization empires with undervalued businesses. They bought the undervalued businesses, and then they milked them. It's again, very that simple. That progressed through the Kravchuk era, that progressed through the Kuchma era. Friends made money. Orange Revolution of 2004 to 2005 gave new hope. That hope soon faded because of the way the system was structured. It was just very hard to break away from the system. But I'll argue that revolution of 2004, 2005 was also a predecessor to the Maidan. The Maidan probably would never have happened if the Orange Revolution had not happened. So again, we're progressively changing. And forgive me for this, I'm a business consultant, and what I consult on is change. Change takes a long time. Change is very difficult. And especially when you're talking about an entire country changing its culture. But the culture of corruption was already rooted in from the Soviet era, abused through the era of privatization. We have this big disparity between those who have and those who have not. Those who have are running businesses that are commodity-based, and they're pillaging the national budget. They're pillaging, every single dollar that's flowing through Ukraine. Some of it is being stolen. Some of it is being used to provide services for countries who are buying the commodities. And I choose not to use the word invest. Very little investment was done at all in that period. It was truly pillaging and really raping the commodity structure. So that is what the young people of Ukraine were seeing. And the reason I take you through that long story is my role. I work for a company at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and what we employed 400 people and still employ close to 400 people in Kyiv and in other parts of Ukraine at this point in time. And there are many young people that work for us, and very young people with open minds, with the excitement of working for a Western company that actually works on ethical principles and principles that do not espouse really raping and pillaging a country of its assets. And these were the model people who actually were out on Maidan then protesting. The protests were not about, this is going to sound strange, but they were not about necessarily joining Europe. They were about their own personal dignity. It was about being treated with respect, treated like a human being, have the country being treated with respect. And these people that were on Maidan, they also understood that the country is a resemblance of themselves. And what happened then in November of 2013 was the president who was elected in 2010 because of the failures of the prior government, and it's very important to understand this, that this is the same president that was really pushed aside for cheating, for wrecking the ballot box in 2004 and 2004 in a couple of elections. He is the one who won in 2010. So you have to think about what the people went through in that period of hope through despair. And he was leading the country to believe that Europe was the way he was taking the country. There were commissions formed, there were groups formed, focus groups, everything to make you believe that he was going to sign an agreement with Europe. And again, for the people of Ukraine, and I know there's some of my colleagues in the crowd from Kyiv and Tatiana, I can't speak for them. I'm an American. I'm born on July 4th at the University of Illinois, so I'm an American, but I lived there, and I saw it, and I sensed it, and I felt it, that this was about being left behind from an opportunity to actually live like a Western person, not from a material standpoint. It's not about living with material goods. It's about living with dignity, with a rule of law, with order. So fast forward, Yanukovych signs, walks away from Europe and decides that Europe is not for him. And arguably, this could be a statement of lack of political will, because for the Ukrainians to actually then start abiding by European rules, that is tremendous change as well. So now you have this culture that not only of the corruption, say at the top, which permeates the entire society, but also we have to start taking a look at things like, for example, subsidized gas. And if you talk about the gas trade in Ukraine and the fact that Russia supplied at that time a significant portion of Ukrainian gas with middlemen, the middlemen were actually the ones that were stealing from the economy. The price was artificially high so that the middlemen had more to steal. But at the same time, it was subsidized for the people, so they would actually use more. Very simple equation. If we subsidize it, if the people aren't paying for their own gas, they're going to use more. Middleman makes more, Russia makes more. We don't have to get too complex about it. That was the structure. And it was like that for many other issues as well. So I apologize for the long wind, but it's a long economic equation. Yanukovych signs walks away from Europe, signs a deal with Russia. I think it was December 17th or 18th. I can't remember the exact date, but I was actually in Washington, D.C. at a conference at that point in time with the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council. And the first thought that came to my mind at that point in time was, wow, Yanukovych is now bailing out. The Ukrainian economy had a gap. There was a budget gap that they had to fill. And that was a perfect play for Russia, perfect play to kind of take the rest of the grips on Ukraine. Medvedev and Putin's plan at that point in time was actually to invest in every single sector of Ukraine through mergers and acquisitions, to get a stake in every single company, including the defense industry, which every single president up to Yanukovych, including Kravchuk, including Kuchma, including Yushchenko, have said was off limits to Russian investment. He was ready to provide the means to do that, took a loan for $15 billion, which actually then put Ukraine at on its knees in front of Russia forever. At that point in time, it was forever. And that then intensified the protests. And like the only thing I could think of at that point in time was, wow, this is the one moment the corrupt Ukrainian oligarchs had to really fund that budget gap. So if they wanted to take a look back at, say, American history and see what our oligarchs did here in America, where they changed their perspective and actually wanted to build institutions as a legacy as opposed to continue stealing, that was the one moment Ukrainian oligarchs had and they didn't take it.
I'm going to jump in here, which is great, and then fast forward it. Because what I'd love Will to do now maybe is say, we had that happen, and then Maidan happened, and the president left. And so we have this quote-unquote major change with a new president, and a West look, Crimea, and the conflict. So the question is, to get to the images on the wall, what was the end result now, 2 years later? And one of the things that, Will, I was hoping you could comment on is, we've talked a lot about the economics of this. The young man that you shared with us is caught in the crosshairs of this, growing up with these cultures, and then the result of this. And what kind of, you've talked about mining, you've taken pictures of this, what this looks like. How do people that you've met and talked to seem to feel about their economic opportunities, both in Kiev where you've shot and then in the East? You seem to have kind of documented a fair amount of what that ended up looking like day to day.
The thing I would point out is that there is or at least my experience in terms of being there, one of the things that I was most sort of impressed by, or not impressed, but noticed, was the economic disparity between the East and West. And there, I have not spent much time in Western Ukraine, which is in terms of the realm around Kiev, and then traveling and moving in Eastern Ukraine. The economic depression and for example, the coal industry, just in terms of its archaic form, was not and is not a competitive market on the international scene. And I think that I would make the argument that there is a legitimate complaint to be made in terms of that disparity between East and West. And I think that while I don't think that the support in Eastern Ukraine for independence, at least at this point, I don't think it's representative of the majority of the population by any scope of the imagination. But I do think that at the beginning of the crisis in Eastern Ukraine, that was definitely exploited by pro-Russian forces and the Kremlin to sort of make this point that Eastern Ukraine was abused and taken advantage of by the West, Western Ukraine. And I think that's an important sort of dichotomy to keep in mind in terms of the development of the country. If you guys would...
Yeah, Tatiana, as someone who's lived in parts of the country and had family from various places.
Actually, I always confused when people say East and West. Do we have West as Western Europe? Do we have West as Western Ukraine? What about Kiev? Is it West? Geographically, it's the center of Ukraine. And one moment, yes, Donetsk region and Lugansk region are the most poorest people live there. Another moment, Renat Akhmetov in the Forbes list and honors everything. And how can we deal with it? Another moment.
Could you just explain who
Renat Akhmetov, he is the owner of most miners in Donetsk region. He is one of the biggest oligarchs in the Eastern European list. He has property in London. He has property. It's not on the scale, but in Poland has a heavy industry. He is in love with soccer, and he built up a wonderful soccer stadium and bring a Euro Cup to Ukraine and in Donetsk. So he is really very rich guy, and yes, and the gossip says that he started to collect weapons in his mines in 2012, 1 year before Maidan has happened. I learned it from people who are volunteering for army now, and they are in the close contact with people. So you can say this is a gossip, but this gossip has grounds, very serious grounds. So, and in terms of economic situation and moral situation and all these forces which were in Ukraine, when Yanukovych received the presidency, people started to be interested to move to Kiev. People started to be interested to move from Donetsk to Kiev. It's okay. But also there were a lot of tensions between people who had small businesses, middle businesses, when people came to them and said that this business doesn't belong to you anymore. You can work here, but you have to pay 75% of your income to us because we are owners. And it's not about the situation on the high level when big guys divide something. No, it's on the small level. People who own a pizzeria, people who own a little hotel, people who built up a restaurant, worked hard in Portugal or Italy, and then was back and created small business. And I know several stories of my friends who gave up their businesses and moved out from the country because they could not deal with such a situation. So, and in the same time, under the rulership of Yanukovych, Donetsk region, Donetsk and Luhansk region had a lot of protection and income and from the state budget because they received budget money for developing of region, but they didn't develop region. They did not put those money into region infrastructure, and we have this situation that in Donetsk people could deal with a lot of things, but their relatives in the minor villages did not have anything.
So we have the exhaustion of corruption and the exhaustion of poverty, it sounds like, just trickling at all levels.
If I could just add one thing to that. Some of you here are my contemporaries and can remember Lou Reed and some of Lou Reed's great lyrics. And one of the things he said is, be careful and don't believe in half of what you see and none of what you hear. And I think that there is a lot of propaganda at play, and unfortunately some young men, if we want to talk about human rights, I think one of the biggest abuses of human rights is propaganda that gets people to do things that are just not necessary or not true. And I think here, if you look at the facts, there's one city in Ukraine that has a level of wealth, and that's Kyiv. That's it. That is the only city. The next wealthiest cities are actually in eastern Ukraine. They're not in western Ukraine. So there's no east and west issue in terms of economics. Eastern Ukraine is wealthier than western Ukraine. Western Ukraine has very little business. Eastern Ukraine had the coal mining industry and the steel industry. The oligarchs, when you take a look at where they come from, the vast majority are from eastern Ukraine. So let's not talk about the fact that eastern Ukraine is poorer than western Ukraine. It is not. It's actually wealthier. The problem is the wealth is concentrated in individuals. And those individuals are the ones who treat their people like robots. And I'll just leave it at that because it's even worse than robots.
I would push back just a little bit in terms of, I mean, I think that is certainly, I can believe that, but I think that in terms of the lived experience for people on the ground, that disparity is lived. And I do think that people, that disparity was then completely taken advantage of in terms of the propaganda machine to build that sort of, that resentment and rage and ease. And I think I think we can't underestimate that. I mean, I think what you said may very well be true, but the experience that I had, at least with talking with people and with going to demonstrations, pro sort of separatist demonstrations, at least at the beginning before the violence broke out, there was a genuine support. It was not by any stretch of the imagination the majority of the population, but there was a genuine support for some sort of pushback against Kyiv. And I think that's important to understand. I think that we can give the oligarchs sometimes more power than they have. So I think that we should keep that in mind.
I'm not arguing the pushback against Kyiv at all. It's just let's not mistake that Kyiv is not Western Ukraine. And there's you mentioned west and east, and I encourage you to travel through Western Ukraine and see the poverty in Western Ukraine. And then, honestly, I mean, you'll see in the Western Ukrainians, there are Western Ukrainians that were also very much encouraged by the Maidan Revolution because they saw that what they saw was an opportunity to get something more than what they had, whereas the Eastern Ukrainians that you refer to, and again, I respect your views and what you saw there because you saw it with your own eyes, but what they were afraid of is that I have very little and somebody's going to take it away, as opposed to I have very little and I'd really like to make it a little bit better. Different perspective.
I want to throw mention two elephants in the room that we haven't talked about as we look forward to ideally what peace building would look like or what an inclusive, I was very taken with Tatiana, your conversations about sort of the essence of Ukrainian, and a Ukraine that accepts many languages, in Ukraine in which everyone is defended, has rights as opposed to only those who speak X or Y or so forth. But I'd like to mention two things and then see if we have some questions from the audience. One is that there's a photograph that we'll talk, which is of a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline running across Ukraine, filled with, I assume, Russian gas, running across Ukraine to be purchased by the West of Europe and used to heat homes and do all sorts of things. So in the middle of this conflict in which people are dying or have died or may die again, we have governments that are fighting proxy wars or direct wars in a country in which we're now selling gas between the two governments, selling and buying gas. The irony of this, I'm sure, is not lost on the people who are actually losing their lives or fearing for their children. And it makes for a very strange conversation in Brussels, European Parliament. In addition to that, we've sat at this table and around the world with our work and talked a lot about Syria. So if you have the Russian Federation actively engaged with supporting a regime in Syria, which is actively engaged in bombing its citizens, along with other people who are killing its citizens, who are then flooding Europe and pushing against governments in Europe who do or don't want to accept them, you have a conversation at the Security Council in which the Russian Federation is playing several games at the same time, regardless of how you feel about who is or isn't supportive or not supportive. And before we go to questions, I just would like, if the panelists want to just say anything at all about those two things in the kind of more geopolitical scale.
Maybe from an economic standpoint, just really quickly, and I don't know if anybody read the news today, but Medvedev was warning the U.S. that be careful about continuing the war in Syria because it can start a next world war. So I found that kind of ironic. But the fact of the matter is the US and Europe need to be helping Ukraine a lot more than they are. Europe in particular. And Europe is struggling. Europe is struggling for many, many reasons. And this Ukraine quote-unquote crisis really came at the wrong time for Europe. They didn't need this right now. They have enough of their own, what they'll call their own problems. But if you take a look at the dependence on Russian gas, and I'm not going to get into the whole game of why it was flowing through Ukraine, but again, corruption, it's very simple. Corruption schemes, they knew who to control, they knew where it went, and that is the reason why natural gas was flowing through Ukraine. It's for the purpose of personal wealth for people in Russia, people in Ukraine, etc. And I'll also go as far as to say people in Europe. They were part of the game. But if you take a look at the countries that are most dependent on Russian gas in Europe, Russian natural gas, and I'm talking about 50% or more of their natural gas comes from Russia. Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, I think Romania, don't quote me on that one.
Germany.
No, Germany is about 22% dependent on Russian natural gas. That's my whole point.
That's still a quarter of it. I mean, that's a significant portion of the countries. And the other...
Less than a quarter.
Okay, but it's still close to a quarter. And the other issue is that there isn't, at this point, a replacement for that gas, which I think is more important. So I think that the issue is that there isn't, at this point, an alternative. There have been conversations about taking pipelines through Turkey, which is now obviously not going to happen because diplomatic relationships between Russia and Turkey, because of Syria, are now no longer, there's no longer an opportunity. It is, and also as a European resident, and hopefully at some point citizen, the Russian gas is a significant issue in terms of national policy in major contexts within Europe. And I think we can't underestimate that. I think that is, and I think that's also partially part of the reason why Europe has not taken a stronger position on this, is because we have a catch-22 here. We have a situation where we're buying gas, whether it's a fraction of the percentage, a quarter, a half, whatever. It's a significant market value. And there's a significant dependency, and more importantly, there is no real alternative at this juncture.
So a couple of things. One, I don't disagree that it is a political issue, but I just wanted to lay out the facts that even in Germany, it's less than a quarter of the dependence. The countries that are actually supporting Ukraine and supporting Ukraine as much as they can are the ones who have a higher dependence on Russian gas. So it's very interesting how it all plays out. So I tend to believe there's more than just a political issue there. I think it goes beyond that. And secondly, there are the countries that have actually taken to replacement of the option are actually making tremendous progress. Ukraine being the first, actually, by the way. So, and the other thing that I find ironic is that the European countries think that the problem was that the gas was flowing through Ukraine instead of from Russia. It's actually Russia controls the switch. So let's not kid ourselves.
I'd like to have Tatiana, before we kick questions, just as the Ukrainian at the table, perhaps have the last word on this topic. Okay, do you have a thought about this? This is your land.
My idea is that we have to develop the sun energy, wind energy, and looking for additional sources of energy. And Ukraine has wonderful geographic situation about it. And also we have own gas, and for us personally in Ukraine it's enough that gas. It's much more about transition from Russia to Europe, Western Europe, who depends, Germany, whatever, but the natural sources for Ukraine, it's enough, and we have wonderful winds and sun, the south of Ukraine, and we should think ecologically about those issues and develop it for independency. And this year was the first year when Ukraine deals independent with the gas issue. So it's the question of negotiation between Russia and Western Europe.
and let them have it, do that. I have to say that if you run for president, I'm gonna come and vote for you, because this is a very inclusive society. I think we should take a couple questions.
Okay, if I just make
Yes,
two
yes.
quick points. Just two recent announcements that I think are important in terms of understanding the conflict and possibly the future of the conflict. Recently, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, announced that it will reopen investigations in the conflict in Georgia, which is significant in that it possibly could then open investigations in Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, this is going to be heavily resisted by the Kremlin, by Moscow. And then the second recent announcement that I think is important to keep in mind is the United States, sort of unofficially or officially, Obama made an announcement via the New York Times last week that the United States is basically going to triple their footprint in terms of expenses for NATO, for American forces in Eastern Europe. It is a one-year plan, it is not a long-term plan, but it is a significant increase in terms of the spending that's going to go towards American and NATO forces in Eastern Europe. Obviously, this I don't think is going to lessen the conflict. I think we're going to see that Moscow will, in some way or form, will have something to say in some sort of response to that. So I think that those are two things to keep in mind, looking forward and thinking about how we find a solution to this conflict.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
Hi, I'm Sam Fang. I have a quick question for you, Will. I know you mentioned that one of the reasons for the conflict is the obvious economic disparity. And you talked about the economic disparity between the people who have and have not in the West and the East. I'm Indian, and if I look at the Gini index, which is the UNDP's economic disparity, Ukraine is about 80, India is about 135. So we're a lot lower. There's a wide income gap in India versus what you see in Ukraine. We have similar problems in India, where you have aggression from China, aggression from Pakistan, proxy wars, diversity in terms of culture, language, etc. But we don't have a similar situation where you have a foreign power kind of taking over, right? I know you mentioned that Russia had been able to incite some of the conflict by manipulating the people and just taking advantage of that economic disparity. The facts kind of don't add up. So I was wondering if there's any other reason for that besides the economic reason that you mentioned. In my mind, it just seems like Putin being a bully, right? And a much stronger foreign power, kind of overpowering a weaker population. Is that a possible answer, or is there truly an economic?
In terms of it just being Russia's aggression, I mean,
Yeah, because you mentioned the economic disparities being one of the primary reasons. When I look at the Gini index and some of the other economic data, it just doesn't seem to add up. Which is why I was wondering, are there any other reasons that are not crystal clear to us?
I'm not sure that those things necessarily are correlated in terms of the data and then the experience and how people react. I don't think that necessarily has to be a direct correlation. I think you could add some contrast in that. I think the other thing that we talked briefly about is the fact that Ukraine, until 1991, with the exception of 4 years between World War I and World War II, has always been within this sort of sphere of influence of Russia. And for Russian nationalists, Putin included, Ukraine is part of Russia, as far as they're concerned. Now, obviously, there's quite a bit of debate and that there's some pushback to that. But I think that that's been really exploited in terms of the Kremlin strategy towards Eastern Ukraine or towards Ukraine in general. Has been playing off of that shared history, whether it be sort of a history of domination or a shared national identity to the cultural share. And I think that that's very important in terms of how we look at the conflict. So my experience on the ground, I have the tendency to try and be as skeptical of both sides as possible. And I think that there has definitely been Russian aggression. There's definitely been Russian participation on the ground. There's definitely support and troops and logistical maneuvering that Russia is doing in Ukraine. But at the same time, I would say that there have been areas of Ukrainian nationalists that have not helped the conversation in terms of bringing this dialogue down to a space that we can have an actual conversation as opposed to just screaming at each other. And they are a small minority. They are not the majority of the population by any stretch of the imagination. But as we see in the United States or anywhere else, strong-worded nationalists oftentimes box above their weight level.
Or Trump, others.
Jenna, can you speak a little bit, I'd just like to have Jenna speak a little bit about this question of, I don't think anybody at the table would say that it is only the economics. There are long traditions. You grew up in a bilingual household. There are many people with many connections to Russia who are Ukrainian and so forth, who might or might not have felt a connection.
There are many connections, but also time is going on, and there are new generations. And 22 years, it's enough time to grow up the generations which were not born in the USSR. Even more, they have no idea what was it. And their parents did not talk to them, because they don't know what is it. I was surprised when I was teaching the class of socialist realism in university in Kiev, and I bring some artifacts to the class, like Penya's camp, some Soviet propaganda from this, and young students of the 20s, they did not know about Pioneer organization. They had no idea who was Lenin and Stalin, because they learned the history of Ukraine and then the world history. And no, they knew about Lenin and Stalin, but Zinoviev, Plekhanov, Trotsky did not appeal to them at all, or other big players. So they don't know what is it. They know only Ukraine, good or bad, but they know only Ukraine. And when you go to school in Ukraine, you know that your heritage, the Kiev-Rus, and that the Yaroslav the Weissman was the father-in-law of Europe. His offsprings were married with kings, princes, and you know that his daughter Anna was married to French king, and that on the wedding celebration she brings the Bible in old Slavonic language, and she was able to put her name. So you know that it has happened to you, and nobody told to you that you are the Soviets. And all other historical periods are teaching in Ukrainian schools, even though schools are with Russian language education through the European discourse. And the new generation is completely different. And is the question, do we want to have a country for our grannies, or we don't, or do want to have the country for our grandchildren? This is the question.
Oksana. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Oksana, I'm Ukrainian. I was born in Ukraine and I lived for the last 16 years in Chicago, love this country. And I think history of my family is a live history of, it's a live Ukrainian history, because, how to say, my parents was born 20 kilometers from Russian border in the town of Glukhov. I was born 20 kilometers from western border in the Lviv region, 20 kilometers from Poland border. And my
son, my two nephews, they went to Kiev Mogilyanska Academia in Kiev. They live and work in Kiev. So it's central Ukraine. It's right the heart of Ukraine in the middle. So I know both sides. I know very well eastern part and I know very well western part. This tale story from Russians, they keep telling that this conflict was made by USA, this recent conflict. That's not the truth. This conflict was going on for centuries. Like recently was released the Caucasus of Ukraine in 1927, I believe. It was 81 million Ukrainians. Now we have 41, where another 40 million disappeared. Do you know where that? I know exactly from the history of my family because, like on my father's side, my grandfather had 5 brothers. 3 of them disappeared in Stalin camps, and who knows, we don't even know where they were killed. On my mother's side, out of 9 children, only my grandmother survived. All 8 other children, it was very prosperous, very educated family. Only 1 person survived out of 9 people. They were all killed by system, by the Soviet system, by the communist system. And now they're telling us that it's just, this conflict was created by USA and all people came to Maidan. Guess what? I know that from the first hand. I know that my son was on Maidan. My 2 nephews was in Maidan. And the most important was the story about my father. My father, right before conflict, lived in Crimea. Last month, they could not hear any news from Ukraine. They only heard all this propaganda from Russia. And one conversation between my father and my son was, my father told to my kids that, you know, all this banda in Kiev took the power, and my son told my father, you know, grandfather, you better leave Crimea right now because tomorrow you will start shooting us. So luckily my father was able to leave Crimea, and he was standing in Maidan together with all my family. That was the story of this conflict. And my question to Will, do you think those, because I did not have a chance to talk to people in Donetsk, and I'm very curious about that. Do you think that those people actually victim of this propaganda, or they really truly believe that they should be some separate country and they would be better off with Russia?
I think it's mixed. I don't think there's a simple sort of response to that. I mean, I think that there are people that genuinely, at least that I talk to, I know obviously through a translator, so there's a certain, something is lost in that translation, obviously. But there were people that I met and talked to that genuinely supported the idea of an independent Donetsk region. And then at the same time, I also watched as the Kremlin's propaganda machine was in full swing, in terms of just watching how RT, for example, was covering the conflict, or the use of Western journalists like Graham Phillips, who's a British journalist who became basically a pro-Russian propaganda machine. And because he was an English speaker, he was extremely effective in terms of getting out that pro-Russian message. So I think that there's a mixed bag. I mean, and I think also as the conflict goes on, when I went to the Ukraine and to Eastern Ukraine when the referendums were about to happen, when the referendum happened in Mariupol, there were thousands of people at the referendum. All of them were supporting the referendum. only because the referendum, in reality, it was only a pro-referendum. There was no option. It was either independence or join Russia. There was no third option, which was to continue on as part of Ukraine. So during the referendum, there was widespread support and there was widespread participation. As the conflict goes on, and that propaganda becomes less and less effective because people are dying and because this sort of myth, this story that's been propagated is not coming true. I think that sort of popular support is probably waning, and it's probably less now than it was at the beginning of the referendum. So I think that yes, there are people that believe, and then there's a lot of people that have been convinced by a really effective propaganda machine.
Take one more, but it has to be really short. We've gone long.
Actually, I have 2 comments. Well, you said that you recognize the Russians invaded and took over Crimea and Donbass, and then there's a but. It's okay because it was always their sphere of influence, and therefore they try to get back with the sphere of influence. Well, you know, if the Americans...
I don't think anybody said that. Is there a question?
My thought wasn't that's it's the contextualize, in the sense that I think that it's very easy in the West, and I'm not speaking about Western Ukraine, I'm talking about West as in Western Europe and the United States. And I think that this is part of the problem with the conflict, and was part of the reason why I went, was that there was a very quick sort of turn to this Cold War rhetoric of East and West, in terms of it being this Eastern aggressor or this Western aggressor, whether it be the United States or Russia. So I think it's important, especially in the United States, to contextualize the conflict and to understand that there is a shared history and that there has been a sphere of influence there. That's not by any stretch of the imagination meant to be an excuse for the Kremlin's actions. And I think that the Kremlin has definitely been an aggressor in terms of how they've gone about dealing with the conflict. But I also think we can't just sort of turn this into a black and white conversation, because it isn't a black and white conversation.
But Ukraine has been independent now 25 years, and this is a foreign country coming into their soil and taking over Crimea without a shot being fired, basically, and 9,000 people losing their lives in Donbass. I mean, that's an invasion, and whether that was part of their sphere of influence or not is irrelevant.
I would argue no, it's not irrelevant. I would argue that it's very.
It is irrelevant. I mean, all right.
Sir,
In my second-
we're gonna wrap. We've gone very long.
we can talk afterwards.
The panelists will be here. It is very kind of you all to stay. We're thrilled. I know that they will stay. I want to thank Will and Tatiana and Lev for joining us. I would like to thank those sponsors who made this possible. I would like to thank all of you for coming out. I hope you'll come out. Our next exhibition will be on LGBTQ rights. It will be in 2 months after this one closes. And then Emerging Lens is our closing of the season with our new young photographer. Artworks has exhibited in the last 9 years in 60 cities and 29 countries around human rights issues. This happens because of all of you. We'll be going into our 10th season next year in the fall, and we hope that you will consider sponsoring and continuing these conversations online. And before you go tonight, please do stop by. Oksana and her company, It's Oksana, have put together a wonderful sale in support of Ukrainian orphans. There are beautiful pillows up front, and if you purchase one, they will help the children. She would love to chat with you about that as well. So thank you very, very much.